For our Canadian friends, this is really one of these cases where our speaker needs no introduction. And that is also the case, I know, for many of our friends from overseas. But there's also a bit of a technical bio on Hugh Segal. So rather than repeat that, let me just spend a minute introducing the speaker and the subject, and then turn it over to him. My own sense, if you'd permit, is that every country should have a Hugh Segal. And if a country doesn't have a Hugh Segal, it's the poorer for it. Hugh Segal has absolutely done everything that there is to strengthen the quality of debate and public policy in this country and indeed in many others. He was interested by politics when he was in school, and the then Prime Minister of Canada visited his school in Montreal, then went into politics, conservative politics, at the federal level, provincially, and every other which way. Along the way, he has been Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister of the country. He has advised several governments at the provincial and federal level. And in 2005 was appointed to the Senate, where he has either headed or been associated with committees related to foreign affairs, anti-terrorism, and poverty and social policy. So that gives you a sense of the breadth and the spectrum of issues that Hugh has dealt with. And I know there are many in this room, yours truly included, who will have had the privilege of being at a committee hearing that Hugh has presided, and indeed at one where he has not been. And one can see the difference that an active and engaged chair and an active and engaged parliamentarian can make. He's also had a scholarly side to him. He's been associated with Queen's University, still is, the University of Toronto, still is, or back, and has also been associated with a fellow think tank, the Institute for Research on Public Policy in Montreal, IRPP. He has also sort of commented in the press, contributed opinions in the press, is a fine public speaker, and late last year was named as the Master of Massey College at the University of Toronto, where he is now and where he calls home. It's not for nothing then that at home at least he is known often as the happy warrior, someone who has ideas and fights for them in all the right ways. And so when we at CG with our friends at CFR were sort of defining the theme of this meeting, we thought that managing the global commons was the broad theme that we would cover. And as you all know, within that we're going to deal with the Arctic, finance, climate change, conflict management, internet, and trade mega deals. What better way then to motivate all of that discussion than to have Hugh Segal with us? And he will be speaking to the question of managing the commons, confronting a core inconsistency. So thank you and welcome, Hugh.
Thank you, Rohinton. It's great to be here. When I was in the Senate, I used to say when I spoke outside the chamber that for a Canadian senator, it's great to be anywhere. Having had some emergency neurosurgery in the last 3 weeks, which worked out just fine, it really is great to be here. And I'm glad to be making my first speech in Ottawa since leaving the Senate to this organization. Let me just apologize for the tremulous nature of my voice. Apparently when they put a breathing tube down your throat for surgery, there are many things that can happen when they move your vocal cords aside so they can work on your vertebrae. There's some bruising, so it'll take some time till my normal, robust process is in place, replacing the present contralto version, which I'm not all that comfortable with. It is good to see so many friends with whom I had the privilege of working in different projects and undertakings and initiatives in my time, both in government and in the research and academic sector. And I think that the presence here in Ottawa at this point, I think is particularly interesting. Let me also say to you, because I have no secrets from this group, I had a completely different speech, John, written last Sunday for this event. It was, John has seen me write this before, he's seen me give it before, he has even seen me do op-eds in his newspapers before, a hawkish, get out the guns, attack the enemy, the time has come, etc.
Bring out the speech, Hugh.
No, I'm not going to do that. Not going to do that for two reasons. A, it's really not appropriate, and B, the United Nations, the United States, a series of countries have now moved in a way to obviate advice I didn't even have a chance to give. And in your business, as you know, giving advice that nobody takes or is only partially consumed can be frustrating. Giving advice that nobody takes at all can be painful, but having your advice taken before you give it is really doubly frustrating. I want to welcome you to Ottawa with our colleagues from the CFR. You're here at a time of what the Chinese would call an interesting circumstance. It would be folly for me to try and enumerate why this is an interesting time. Enumerating the elements of our present circumstance globally, economic, strategic, environmental, technological terms, would be the kind of profound grasp of the obvious that would be a misuse of your time, and I don't want to be part of that. What I do want to share are a few perspectives on the dynamics of international relationships, both at the state and non-state level, which I hope you will find modestly constructive in your discussions over the next day and a half. Let me start with the issue of the competition in terms of state and non-state actors relative to the core challenges we are all facing. We can see this in a bunch of theaters where critical international and domestic challenges of various kinds are rolling out. A small insurgent group in East Africa seeking to challenge the duly elected government of a country is in many, many ways very different from a radical animal rights group or environment group in Europe or America or Japan. But their core notion that government is incompetent, corrupt, or both on the issues they care about is not very different. The measures they may seek to employ, their tolerance for violence or its promotion, may be vastly different, but the task of supplanting legitimate authority, in fact, the apparent legitimacy and priority of doing so, whether it's on environmental regulation or who runs a chunk of Mali, is deadly and very much apparent. Why is this vital on the issue of the management of the global common? Because whether we are talking about the impact of symmetry and diplomacy in the Arctic, international financial relations, the happy world of climate change, peace, security, regulating the web or trade megadeals, any and all of the coherence or integrity of any undertakings reached depends on the perception of fairness, the actual enforceability of terms to which there has been agreement, and the veritable legitimacy of the governance measures for protecting the common that is put into place. While it is true that radical and vicious self-reverent insurgencies are rarely driven by issues of fairness and legitimacy, it is also true that those who become supporters, either passive or otherwise, of the insurgents, either by looking the other way or actually helping, are often driven by how fair their overall context, ethnically, economically, or otherwise was before the insurgency was initiated. This is true of the Iraqi-Sunni geographic frame around the present Sunni ISIL aggression. It would also be true among the many who have been prepared to go to jail over the pipeline issue in North America as we speak. One group is essentially unlawful, violent, and terrorist, the other employing civil disobedience, but largely within the law. What this means for all those in government and industry and NGOs and labor and advisory groups, domestically and internationally, is that if we are going to be able to drain the swamp for potential insurgencies, or diminish the naturally occurring popular support base for violating agreements on a host of critical global and common issues, we need a much broader sense of social license, not only for the various present and potential areas of consensus on aspects of the common, but a radically different approach to the way governments and international authorities address these issues of the common good. Many countries sitting here this evening address parts of this part by insisting on parliamentary votes before critical decisions are made. In the face of a minority government some years ago, Prime Minister Harper, in dealing with whether Canada should continue its engagement in Afghanistan, pulled together a not partisan task force headed by a Liberal former Deputy Prime Minister, various other distinguished people, Fen Hampson's colleague, Derek Burney, a former ambassador to the United States, and others. And they did a detailed analysis of what Canada's options and choices and responsibilities were. And that was seen to be nonpartisan, not narrow, straightforward. Its recommendations were accepted by the two major parties in our House of Commons, and the mandate to continue was passed via a resolution of the House of Commons. And that meant that whatever the difficulties were in the period of time between that task force and the end of the period in Afghanistan, the government had a measure of insulation and legitimacy for what had been done. In majority government circumstances, where governments are formed by one party, not a problem for our Israeli friends, it's more problematic. Truth of the matter is that because we have a first-past-the-post electoral system, parties can be elected with something far less than a majority of the voters. And that produces some difficulties. Minority governments, proportional representation, increase the legitimacy benefit of that process. Our challenge, it strikes me, is very clear. That is, how do we address the core legitimacy issues that relate to the issues of the common? Think now about financial regulation, or climate change, or internet governance, or the Arctic and other areas where serious dissent from a regulatory context or consensus to protect the common could produce organized subgroups of violators, hackers, alternate or black market shadow banking, or serial polluters who actually increase their willful darkening of our climate's environmental prospects for global financial stability, cyber coherence, and the rest, and in the end, for life itself. And while having run a think tank myself in Canada and sat on the advisory board of two international think tanks, one in London dealing with strategic affairs and the other in Stockholm dealing with democracy promotion, I understand that think tanks are about evidence-based ideas, constructive research, and a genuine contribution to the marketplace of insights and understanding. Let me also suggest that in moving ahead on the challenge of the new global common, there is an overarching priority that should not be forgotten. The issue of communication, education strategies, the due process and legitimacy development vital to gain social license, not only for the solutions reached, but for the process by which they are achieved, has never been more important. Saying it is necessary to take this task or that task without researching and identifying the best way it must be done, embracing the populations, subgroups, marginalized and special interests that might be impacted, or whose assent is vital for a measure of success, social license it implies, and the different communication options or innovations would simply be a cop-out. Frankly, on the global common issues, think tanks that say what needs to be done, evidence-based, are very helpful. But think tanks that also research and frame legitimacy strategies, communications tactics, electronic, social, digital, written broadcast, word of mouth, and community engagement, these will be the think tanks that make more of a difference. I have argued before, and I put it to you this evening, that every step ahead we make on the international and domestic priorities that drive our world are tied to two critical freedoms: freedom from fear and freedom from want. This is no less true of the global common issues you will be considering. Peace and security and terrorism are tied, as I found out when I chaired the Senate Committee on Anti-Terrorism, are tied closely to the dynamics of these two freedoms. Fear drives the attitude towards many issues of internet regulation. This is no less true on climate change, no less true on prospects for the Arctic. What I mean by this is very simple. If the inhabitants of the countries that border the Arctic, right on the cusp of the Arctic Ocean, are poor and not able to live beyond meager subsistence, their attitude to agreements on environmental protection and mineral rights will be different than if their freedom from want was more robust. If there's no legitimacy to an agreement between Arctic neighbors for the peaceful, environmentally prophylactic transit of the Arctic, the appropriate environmental understandings in place for any Arctic resource sharing engagement, then this will seed the Arctic with concerns about freedom from want and could in fact produce strategic risk. In the present welcome multi-nation strategy on ISIS, which has financial tracking, anti-terror financing, combat, diplomatic isolation, and other important elements for which I give the Americans and their allies great credit, it is important that we understand that this response to the need to deal with sustaining freedom from fear in the Middle East cannot be an isolated engagement. We need to know now, in terms of legitimacy, what is being done on the planning for freedom from want, an important pillar that should be constructed now and be ready to deploy as soon as an area now under ISIS occupation is liberated and stabilized. Colleagues, history is not predictive, but it sure is instructive. The horror of the Korean conflict, the massive carnage and destruction of World War II, all could have had massive follow-on fallout, figuratively and literally, future generations. Massive protection for Korea and the massive investment it made possible, the remarkable scope and reach of the Marshall Plan in Europe and otherwise. Failure to plan, allocate the cash, build the cadres with whom this economic and social progress can be achieved would be another sort of abdication of the kind that typified the world's reaction to Afghanistan after the successful multinationally supported Mujahideen expulsion of the old Soviet Union. So our task on the global common, I would argue, is clear. The will to protect requires the ability to build legitimacy, communicate, and sustain the conditions of the two freedoms. In a world where Western democracies are less deferential to their governments, where the combination of polarization and complexity on most issues is deeply challenging, if not problematic, and where technology affords governments precious little time to understand, plan, and shape strategic responses to emergent or pervasive issues, this will not be easy. Social media will not add to the joy. But sometimes, colleagues, crises of the regional kind we are experiencing, as in the Middle East, as we gather here for dinner, can help. I was one of those who wrote and argued, both in the Senate and elsewhere, for an early military intervention in Syria. When a dictator uses his own artillery and air force on his own people, it is a direct invocation of the responsibility to protect doctrine. The fact that the UN would be stopped by a Russian veto in protection of Russia's client state interests speaks to the UN's paralysis in the face of a veto system that is the opposite of legitimacy. And the fact that neither the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or major European powers could get the internal political coherence to assemble a coalition of the willing seeded the clouds over Syria and the soil underneath it with the seeds of what we find now. It is always more expensive to wait and not always more prudent. And the lesson from Syria for President Putin informed his initiatives on Crimea and may well have led to the circumstances that saw a Malaysian air tragedy passenger 30,000 feet take place over eastern Ukraine. Consequences of inaction are always as serious, if not more so, than the cost of intervention. So as I rejoice in the joint action engaged this past fortnight on ISIS, it occurs to me that the convergence of freedom from fear and freedom from want as tactical and strategic goals may be at hand, or at least could be. This could produce not only direct action against violent insurgents who are only about money, power, cruelty, domination, rape, slavery, and constructing a caliphate of fear, but awaken among all of us a more profound embrace of why a follow-on strategy that addresses the fear of want, the mass of humanity caught up in this tragedy, is vital and required. I offer it not as a prayer, but as a hope, because if we are to engage on the new global common with instruments that will be both credible and successful, nothing less than the embrace of the two freedoms and the legitimacy they inspire will do the job. I wish you Godspeed in your deliberations over the next day and a half. Thank you. Glad to take any questions or personal attacks you care to offer, but don't feel under any compulsion. Gordon Smith, distinguished former Deputy Secretary of Everything, Ambassador to NATO, and a great Canadian. Gordon.
You have to keep moving, Hugh.
Yep.
What I'd like to ask you is, as someone who, as Rohinton said, has been everywhere in the public policy field, what your reaction is as to the best way to engage politicians who are, after all, out there looking for re-election, for their party to be re-elected. How do you get politicians who will obviously want to relate to their electorate to better engage with these big global issues that do require management?
My instinct has always been that it will be very, very hard to get a broad discussion in a rural constituency, let us say in Saskatchewan, on green gas emission issues writ large. But when you can connect it with flooding, when you can connect it with specific implications that raise the cost of crop insurance, you can begin to build a consensus that we've got to find a better way. And my problem with Naomi Klein, who I admire and who I think is brilliant and creative, is when you say that the core problem on climate change is that capitalism is bad. She may be right. There may be parts of her argument which are quite right. But the truth is, as is the case with every other major reform we have done, you've got to get government, the not-for-profits, and the business sector engaged together with labor and others. That's how you get forward movement. Dividing people up by saying, we care about the economy, you don't. When they actually do care about the economy, they just want to see it more sustainable over a longer period of time, is no way to build a coalition. I think the next federal election will be about, frankly, three political parties, all interesting in terms of the dynamics of their leaders, trying to build a coalition that is seen to be rational and balanced. And neither one, in my judgment, will be able to ignore those views which they think are only held by a small part of the population, because what we now know, by virtue of the polling and the research, is that, and the technocratic connection between kids and their iPhones and all the rest, is that the broad understanding of these linkages is much more intense than narrow interest groups who just have one particular view. So, short answer is, connect it to day-to-day life, and you have a shot at making progress. And of course, if you're a lobbyist for a particular view, you've got to convince a political party to put into its platform those kinds of connections so that they have a reason to make the case in the campaign.
Hugh?
Sir, yes, Fen.
I thought perhaps you were overly polite about Naomi Klein, but that's not going to be my question. Fen Hampson from CG. A terrific set of comments, Hugh. My question is, I really thought R2P was dead after Syria, and I thought it was interesting in the way you resurrected the concept in the speech. I see Paul Heinbecker over at his table doing cartwheels as one of the bureaucratic architects of R2P. But you know, given UN deadlock, as you mentioned, you know, who carries the R2P flag, and do you see much appetite, you know, notwithstanding what we're seeing right now in Iraq and Syria with this bombing campaign, much appetite to pursue the two strands of R2P that you identified, freedom from fear, freedom from want?
Well, you know, we all have a way of, we all have the chance to take a look at the government's engagements and interventions and come to some analytical conclusion about what they're doing. I would argue that for all his many successes and failures, the maternal health initiative is a freedom from want kind of engagement, and the fact that you can lever the Gates and other countries into this process so you increase a woman's chance at life, safe birth, woman's chance at education. You can decrease the notion of child marriages and invest heavily to do that. I think that's one way of dealing with fear of want and trying to diminish it. On freedom from want and trying to diminish it. With respect to freedom from fear, I think that, of course, requires a much more muscular capacity to engage, and it always increases the level of risk for those countries that want to engage. And we have to be frank that we have many of our partners and friends around the world who can't think of any reason other than an attack on their own borders where military engagement is going to help. While I may not agree with them, I certainly understand that view to be sincere and genuine. So we have to find ways on the freedom from fear frame to put proposals forward that can be constructive. And I think, you know, every generation has its own. Paul will remember Minister Axworthy and the Landmines Treaty. There are things that can be done that make a difference. I think some of the things that we have done with respect to religious freedom and engaging, the fact that we made a military commitment to help in a technical way in Iraq, the fact that we had at one point 2,500 Canadian forces doing, amongst other things, ensuring that Afghan kids could go to school. So, you know, it's never perfect. There's always difficulties in execution. There's always blowback. But that doesn't mean, and this is where I think this week is actually quite helpful and hopeful, doesn't mean you stop trying. Because when you stop trying, the folks for whom marketing marketing fear and want and using it for their own narrow purposes, they're the ones who are encouraged. And we can never send, in my judgment, the signal that you do your thing, it's not a problem for us. That's what we have to avoid at all costs.
Thank you. To recap on your answer and the previous question, practically speaking, do you suggest to explore a new mechanism for decision making in terms of the judgment where to intervene and where not to on the international front and on the domestic one?
Gilead, I would be of the view that, and this is, let me say this, I'm a big fan of the UN, big fan of its international agencies, health, food, UNICEF, High Commissioner on Refugees. I mean, I just think they do superb work. But it is clear that at the political accountability end, no fault of the good people who work there, the constitutional structure makes it impossible for them to act if one of 5 countries' interests are deemed to be unassailable. So that says to me, if you can't go there for accountability, and if it can't be trusted on accountability, there has to be another answer. And I would argue that whether it is in some context NATO, whether it's the EU, whether it's others who have some capacity to come to some deliberation with our allies in various regions, we need to have a much more intense, focused capacity to pull that trigger, to use an unpleasant expression, so that those who think they can get away with an incursion into a place like Kuwait or elsewhere and not be confronted within a reasonable period of time will understand that whatever else they may be thinking, that's not true. And right now, if I were someone advising someone who was planning on that kind of incursion, I would say 50-50 whether you ever pay a price. Right? And I just don't think it's good enough, because there are going to be a lot of passenger airplanes that could be shot down by mistake. It's happened in the past. There will be a lot of those sorts of problems that will happen because people will think there is impunity. And whether you're talking about human rights in the killing fields in Sri Lanka, or whether you're talking about what happened in Burma before the reform, impunity is the enemy. Impunity is how innocent people die. Impunity is how children lose their rights. And that's where we, I think, have to, as a human community, do better. The UN, analytically, the UN in terms of special rapporteurs, can do superb work. Even the crazy Human Rights Council, which is nutty in some respects, will focus in on things that can't be avoided because they do so. And they did that with Premier Cameron on Sri Lanka, and that is probably better for having happened than not having happened. But the notion that we just say, look, it's the UN without UN authority, my Prime Minister, Mr. Chrétien, said that. I understand, I respect his view, but I think it is naive, and it's kind of walking through the graveyard without seeing what's actually going on. John.
Hugh, in this wonderful year at CG, one of the best things about it is drinking beer on Tuesday nights in a pub with research fellows and with senior fellows.
We do that at Massey, but it's usually sherry.
Yes, I know.
Sorry.
And I will get that tab at Massey paid off.
Don't you worry.
And one of the things I've more than once thrown out is, are you entirely sure that anything actually gets done as a result of what you do? There is a historical argument that democracies especially are incapable of addressing existential threats in the way that word is currently being used, unless and until they are shocked into action. From the fight against slavery to the Second World War to global warming, nothing will actually get done until broad populations are horrified at what is happening and demand instant action, at which point democracies then become very good at moving swiftly. If you accept that historical analysis, and I'm not inviting you to, what then is the point other than to wait for the next big shock and act then?
Well, if you look at any kind of shallow framework analysis of history, it is interesting that because of how beaten up after World War I, lots of Europe was, including the British, Czechoslovakia wasn't enough. They were looking for, off-ramps for Hitler and themselves, and there's only when Poland happened that they said, this is it. I would argue that there'll be a division of opinion in this room about whether or not the West should have engaged in support of some measure of civility in Syria when Assad opened fire on his own people. And I can understand the arguments why folks chose not to do so. But I would say that that this is actually making your point. The fact that now there is a much bigger coalition and consensus is because what emerged from the lack of engagement the first time, namely ISIS, is so horrific. It violates so many premises of basic decency and geopolitical sanity that there is no choice. So the question becomes, and this is where I think think tanks can do great work, what is the opportunity for engaging earlier in a way that diminishes the worst case circumstance? And I would argue that history argues very intensely that engaging earlier will be more modest in cost, maybe higher in risk, but it won't be any worse than what happens when you have 8 million people under the control of 6,000 of these ISIS chaps facing God knows what. So, and I think, if I may say so, to think about the Council on Foreign Relations, CG, and other counterparts around the world, is that they have two real powers. One is to point to threads of thematic issues that may not be apparent right away to the actual politicians and military types who are looking at this, but who need to see some of those threads clearly and early, number one. And the other is the power to convene. I don't know if our British friends are here tonight, but the International Institute of Strategic Studies has been convening events, as the Foreign Relations Council does, in Geneva and in Qatar and in Singapore on a regular basis, bringing together people who don't normally connect with each other. And you know, the Chinese Minister of Defense or Chinese Chief of the Defense Staff with his counterpart from Belgium to discuss some common issues. Those linkages are really, really, really very important. I remember when I visited the Canadian Forces Base, HMCS, the one on the West Coast. Which one is that, Gordon? What is it?
I don't know.
Oh, sure you do.
I think it ran into its partnership.
Thank you, Esquimalt. And I remember sitting with the commanding officer, who was a commanding officer of the Canadian fleet, and I asked him about his relationships with China. And he said, well, they're very good, because the head of the Chinese Navy and I were in a course together at Annapolis on some sort of weapons navigation, whatever, and we developed a friendship which we've maintained. Your ability as organizations to convene folks from different parts of the world so that they don't, and if you think about the Trilateral Commission, the whole purpose of the Trilateral Commission started after WW2 by the Rockefellers was to make sure that Japanese, European, North American elites were never apart, that they were connected, that they knew what was going on, they understood what was happening. And I think your ability, your organization's ability, organizations in this room, to convene people with very different perspectives, backgrounds, and experience is another instrument by which we can avoid things like war and the difficulties associated therewith.
Hugh, I've agreed for so many years on everything you said ever since you were the editor of the Fulcrum at Ottawa University. So for once, I'm a bit worried, because changing your speech just because things happened the way you thought it would leaves me, from a parochial point of view, a bit worried about our own take of our own Prime Minister going to New York. What has changed, and to what extent a speech that he made, being at, first of all, the Security Council to support Obama for the first time after having been so much at loggerheads with the President of the United States, which is never very good for Canada, and then giving us a maternal health and child health speech that we all knew about. We could have written it for him. What has really changed? To what extent are we not being bullied by a presence that was much more political, despite the beauty of it?
Well, it is amazing, Ferry, how every once in a while politicians have to deal with politics. Happens. It's like chefs having to deal with dough, you know, it happens. I think the change is as follows. I think we went from a Western world which was troubled by ISIS, not sure what to do, where the Americans were kind of considering what leadership made sense, where they actually pulled the pin, and that set off a series of things which I think were quite constructive, number one. Number two, in Canada's case, we had already had a parliamentary delegation with the minister in Iraq, and providing some insights about what kind of technical assistance we could give them in their training mission. And I think training missions are something which Canadians are getting very good at. And that led to a fair measure of consensus about we need to do something. We're not quite sure what, but we need to do something. And then I think when the Prime Minister answered the question from the editor of the Wall Street Journal, that we have now other matters that have been put to us as possible, and we will have a cabinet discussion, and we will have a parliamentary debate to the extent combat is involved. That did move the puck down the ice quite substantially. And to be fair to him, it was not as if, as our leader of the opposition says, he was keeping anything from Canadians, because he probably has yet to see, he may be seeing as we sit here tonight, the options document prepared by PCO and the Department of National Defense about what is attainable, what is doable, and what we're being asked to do by our allies. And that will energize the debate in Cabinet tomorrow. I suspect it'll energize, and this is just surmise, a briefing for the leaders of the opposition, and then the government caucus on Wednesday, and probably a full debate, I would argue, at some point this week. So that is a fair piece further, Ferry, than where we were 3 or 4 weeks ago, where there was a lot of pent up, we got to do something, you know, kind of a fire drill running around, but nobody actually with any coherent plan. And the notion that the American president said however many weeks ago, we don't have a strategy, I appreciate his frankness, because anybody who could have said 6 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago, we know where this is headed, would have been making it up, because I don't think anybody did. Alors, mille fois merci. Thank you all very much.